Hey guys, tonight we are easing into a history that is simultaneously very high status and deeply unsettling. We're going to talk about ancient Chinese eunuchs not just as historical footnotes, but as figures of immense tangible power that if you were a palace official, an ambitious concubine, or even a provincial governor, you probably lived in perpetual low-grade fear of. I want you to close your eyes if you feel safe enough and visualize the scene. You are a relatively minor official, a scholar bureaucrat, perhaps trudging through the vast, echoing courtyards of the Forbidden City. The air is thick, not just with the smoke of incense, but with the pressure of a million watchful eyes. As you approach the inner sanctum, the very center of the universe, you pass an elderly man. He's dressed in fine silk, probably a shade of deep purple or dark green, marking his rank. His face is smooth, almost unnaturally so, like a worn piece of marble. He carries no weapon. He just carries a scroll, maybe a fan. His movements are precise, silent, almost gliding. He is the personification of proximity to the dragon throne. He is utterly indispensable, yet he is also, by definition, utterly incomplete. And it's that very incompleteness, that willing sacrifice, that makes him one of the most dangerous people you could ever cross. You realize deep down that you are walking a tightrope 1,000 feet high, and one little whisper from this man could send you falling without a net. You probably won't survive this environment if you don't understand the rules of his unique kind of authority. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, drop your location and local time in the comments. It's always fascinating to see where this history finds you. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We begin our journey into the world of the eunuch, the Taijian, by focusing on the single, inescapable, physical reality that defines him: the imperial gaze and the wounds. To understand the fear they inspired, you first have to understand the why of their presence. You are serving an emperor, the Son of Heaven, who sits at the apex of a rigidly patriarchal dynastic system. This man, the one with absolute power, has not just a single empress, but a vast, meticulously organized harem filled with thousands of concubines, ladies-in-waiting and serving women. The entire purpose of this inner court, the Nei Ting, is to secure the continuation of the dynasty by producing heirs. The sexual politics are literally the politics of the state, and this is where the eunuch steps in, or rather, where he is forced in. By the logic of the court, any man with intact plumbing who had unsupervised access to the harem, to the mother of a potential future emperor, was an unforgivable security risk. The cost of one indiscretion, one illegitimate heir, accidentally slipping onto the throne, was nothing less than the collapse of the entire dynasty. It was a problem of risk management on a massive scale. The mainstream historical fact here is simple, but profound eunuchs were employed to act as a gender buffer, a living, breathing firewall between the two halves of the palace, the masculine administrative outer court, and the feminine reproductive inner court. They were the only male bodies permitted to reside permanently in the deepest, most private areas of the palace, the places where the emperor ate, slept, and crucially conducted his private life. Imagine yourself as one of these junior eunuchs. You are scrubbing floors, or maybe you are holding the robes while the emperor changes. You are a shadow, a fixture, invisible but always present. You see things, you hear things. The empress whispers something about a rival concubine. The emperor lets slip an opinion about a minister while he's getting a shave. Because you are, by the standards of the time, effectively desexed, you are seen as harmless, a kind of sophisticated furniture. And this perception, this historical underestimation of the harmless eunuch, is the single greatest tool in your burgeoning kit of power. Now, for a quirky or fringe tidbit, the sheer numbers involved were staggering. While the early Han Dynasty had perhaps a few hundred eunuchs by the peak of the Ming Dynasty, estimates for the total number of eunuchs serving the court could range between 70,000 and 100,000 men across the empire. Think about that. An entire shadow bureaucracy, a separate social class larger than the entire population of many contemporary European cities. They weren't just personal servants. They were a vast, complex organization with its own internal ranks, titles, and political factions. The physical reality of their entry is, of course, the part that is hard to think about, but we must acknowledge it. The act of castration, the gong xing, was the price of entry. Historically, it began as a form of criminal punishment for serious offenses, a penalty considered less severe than death, but arguably more humiliating. The idea was to eliminate the male's ability to propagate, removing him from the lineage. But over time, it evolved into a voluntary choice for the desperately poor, the socially ambitious, or in the case of conquered peoples, a mandatory selection for servitude. The life of a eunuch, even a low-ranking one, offered a path away from famine and rural poverty, a tantalizing sliver of access to the imperial wealth. But here is where the fear truly begins to curdle in the hearts of the court. The eunuchs had nothing left to lose in the conventional sense. They had sacrificed the most fundamental markers of manhood and lineage. They would have no sons to carry on their name or tend to their graves. This immense, irreplaceable loss often bred a deep and complex psychology, sometimes extreme loyalty to the one man who justified their sacrifice, the emperor, and other times a boundless, sometimes vicious ambition to amass spiritual material or political power as a substitute for the power of procreation. They were men whose entire existence was predicated on a fundamental, painful rejection of the natural order. This made them unpredictable. Historians still argue whether the eunuchs' perceived ruthlessness was a psychological reaction to their mutilation, a form of compensatory aggression, or simply the natural sociological outcome of granting immense unsupervised power to a class of men who operated outside the traditional Confucian constraints of family duty and scholarly morality. Were they inherently malicious or just perfectly positioned to become corrupt? You, as the nervous scholar official, don't care about the academic debate. You just know that the man gliding past you with his soft voice and his perfect memory can destroy your reputation, your career, and your family with a single, carefully placed sentence to the emperor's personal attendant. His eyes, the only part of him that can still truly penetrate the inner court, are watching you. And in the next section, we'll look into the brutal, practical reality of that entry, the castration itself, and what it meant practically for their power. We left you standing in the shadow of the forbidden city walls, keenly aware of the silent, gliding eunuch who embodies both power and pain. Now you must move beyond the vague concept of castration and face the specific, agonizing reality of castration, the necessary gateway. Now, this is not just a medical procedure. It is the fundamental, often deadly initiation rite into the imperial power structure. It is the crucible where a man dies and a court servant is born. Imagine the decision. You are a peasant boy, maybe 10 or 12 years old, watching your family starve during a drought. Or perhaps you are the third or fourth son of a poor family with no land to inherit. The court, through various intermediaries, offers a chance servitude inside the palace walls, guaranteed food, silk clothing, and most importantly, the chance for a status unimaginable in your village. But the cost is absolute. This process, known historically as zigong, literally self-palace or self-punishment, when self-performed or state-mandated gongxing was not performed by doctors in sterile operating theaters, it was carried out by specialist hereditary cutters in small private establishments outside the palace gates, most famously during the Ming Dynasty in the Bochuan S Treasury Department. You are led into a dimly lit room. The cutter, known as the Daozi Jiang, is not a man of medicine, but a man of tradition and grim experience. His tools are basic. A sharp curved knife, sometimes called the landau or scooping knife, often wrapped in cloth or reserved for this sole purpose. Hot pepper oil to sterilize, or rather, just to burn. And alum powder to staunch the bleeding. There are no anesthetics, certainly nothing effective. At best, you might be given large doses of opium, or a simple herbal mixture that leaves you numb but still terrifyingly aware. The mainstream historical fact is the simplicity and brutality of the technique. The entire external genitalia, penis, and testicles were typically removed simultaneously in a single, swift cut against the base of the abdomen. The goal was total removal, to ensure there was absolutely no chance of even residual sexual function, or more critically, an erection, which could be taken as an insult or a threat in the presence of the emperor's women. After the procedure, a metal plug or a tube, often a stalk of wheat or barley, was inserted into the urethra to prevent it from closing up during the initial healing, allowing for urination. Now here is the terrifying reality that made this gateway such a gamble. The death rate was astronomically high. Historians still argue whether the figure was closer to 20% or 40% in some periods, but regardless, you are talking about hundreds of thousands of boys over the centuries undergoing this process with a significant chance of dying from shock, overwhelming infection, sepsis, or hemorrhage in the days that followed. You survived the cut. Now you have to survive the fever. You would be kept prone in excruciating pain, often without water for 3 days because they believed passing urine or moving too much would risk the wound opening. When the plug was removed on the 3rd day, the ability to urinate was the final terrifying test of success. If you couldn't pass water, that meant the urethra had sealed and your end was swift and horrific. This vulnerability, this intense physical trauma, is the quirky or fringe tidbit that often gets overlooked. The collective memory of pain bound the eunuchs together as a singular, powerful faction. They had survived an ordeal that most men would consider death. They were literally scarred for life, and this shared experience created a unique, almost familial bond. The Taijian were brothers in suffering. When a young boy survived and began to climb the ranks, the older eunuchs would protect and mentor him, creating an intricate web of patronage and loyalty that completely bypassed the traditional Confucian social structure of family and clan. You didn't owe your loyalty to your father's house. You owed it to the man who secured your position and guided you through the inner court's viper pit. This deep, shared trauma fueled a sense of entitlement and unity that terrified the scholar officials. The officials derived their authority from their scholarly qualifications, their family names, and their adherence to strict ethical codes. The eunuchs derived their authority from their proximity and their willingness to sacrifice everything they had paid in blood and tissue. They saw the officials with their moralizing and their lack of palace access as soft and fundamentally irrelevant to the emperor's personal needs. And so, historians still argue whether the eunuch system persisted for over 2,000 years because the emperors genuinely feared the security risk of intact men in the harem, or because the emperor realized the immense political advantage of having a class of personal servants who, having sacrificed their biological future, were utterly dependent on the emperor for their current status, and as we'll discuss next, their spiritual salvation. You survived the operation. You are in. You are healed, or at least you are functional. You are clean, silent, and present. And that scar, that missing part, is no longer a wound. It is a ticket, a literal passkey into the sanctum sanctorum of imperial power. The officials can only look from the outside. You are already inside, adjusting the emperor's pillow, listening to his final unguarded thoughts before sleep. And that's why they fear you, not because you are powerful yet, but because you are close. You have achieved proximity, and in the imperial court, proximity is the ultimate currency of fear. The price of that proximity, we will see in the next section, was too precious to simply discard. The fear of the eunuchs, as you now realize, is built upon a foundation of blood and ambition. But the story of their castration doesn't end when the wound heals. It transitions into one of the most peculiar, unsettling, and powerful traditions of the entire imperial system, the hidden vault of the bow. You survived the cutter, the pain, and the terrifying fever. Now you stand clean and healed, ready for duty. Yet you are still incomplete, not just socially, but spiritually. To the traditional Chinese mind, the body was given by your parents, and to keep it whole was a matter of filial piety and spiritual completeness. To enter the afterlife as a full man, to be fit for reunion with your ancestors, you needed every part of yourself. This is where the concept of the bao or treasure comes in. The mainstream historical fact is that the eunuchs' severed parts were meticulously preserved, dried, and stored by the specialist cutter or a designated keeper. This bao was the only physical proof of the eunuch's full male identity before the castration, and its recovery was absolutely critical for his future. Think of it as a metaphysical insurance policy. The eunuch would pay a significant fee, sometimes borrowed, at exorbitant interest to the cutter, not just for the operation, but for the guaranteed safekeeping of his treasure. Imagine the scene: small, highly prized porcelain jars or lacquer boxes meticulously labeled, lining the shelves of the cutter's private chamber. Inside your box, the dried, preserved tissue, sometimes steeped in oil or quicklime weights. This little box, this tiny piece of flesh, is the most important document of your life. It dictated your entire trajectory in the court and was a powerful lever of control wielded by the cutters. The eunuchs themselves would often refer to the successful retrieval of their bao as the ultimate goal, sometimes paying vast sums to buy it back once they had achieved status in the court. The idea was that upon death, the bao would be interred with the eunuch's body, ensuring his physical integrity for the spiritual journey into the next world. Without it, you were a ghost, without a complete shadow, destined in the popular mind for a wandering, incomplete existence in the afterlife. This tradition leads us to the quirky or fringe tidbit that perfectly illustrates the eunuch's unique political leverage. The possession of a eunuch's bao could be used as an incredibly potent form of blackmail. The cutters or subsequent owners of a high-ranking eunuch's treasure held the key to his spiritual peace. If you were a powerful grand eunuch and a rival managed to steal or destroy your bao, it wasn't just physical vandalism, it was a devastating spiritual and psychological attack. Conversely, a eunuch who had successfully bought back his bao and placed it in a secure, often hidden spot felt an immense sense of security and completeness, which freed him to be even more ruthless in his pursuit of power in the present. He had secured his future. Now he could dominate the now. For the nervous scholar official, watching the eunuch glide by, this spiritual completeness, or lack thereof, added another layer to the fear. The traditional official was grounded in his family, his ancestors, and his lineage. He feared disgrace, and he feared not having a son to perform the ancestral rites. The eunuch, having already severed the possibility of lineage and having purchased his spiritual completeness with a physical sacrifice, operated on an entirely different moral plane. He was a man who had already passed through a type of living death. What was there left to threaten him with loss of life was secondary. Loss of the Bao was the ultimate terror. This is why, as the eunuchs rose in power, they created their own parallel social structures. They would adopt sons and nephews, often poor boys from their home regions, to serve as their spiritual heirs and perform the necessary rites. They formed tight-knit families and brotherhoods inside the palace walls, providing social and emotional support that the officials found impossible to penetrate. They were an organizationally cohesive entity, bound by their shared ordeal, their spiritual dependency on the Bao, and their absolute reliance on the imperial system. Historians still argue whether the enduring obsession with the Bao was primarily driven by ancient beliefs in spiritual completeness, or whether the system was deliberately maintained and financially exploited by the cutters and the inner court bureaucracy as a brilliant self-sustaining control mechanism to ensure the eunuchs remained psychologically dependent on the institutions that had first mutilated them. Either way, the Bao represented an immense and deeply personal vulnerability that an enemy could exploit. You, the court watcher, understand now that the eunuch's power isn't just administrative. It is existential. He has traded the possibility of a biological future for a guaranteed present. He has placed his soul in a porcelain box and locked it away, and that chilling psychological freedom is what makes him so terrifyingly effective as an agent of imperial will, or, as we'll see next, a powerful will of his own, using his physical sacrifice as a literal passkey to the emperor's private chambers. You have survived the initial shock of the eunuch's reality, the blood price of entry, and the spiritual terror of the Bao. Now you must focus on the immediate, terrifying payoff of that sacrifice, beyond the gate's access and intimacy. This is the moment your understanding of their fear shifts from pity or revulsion to pure, pragmatic political calculation. The castration was the removal of a man's future. The resulting proximity to the emperor was the guarantee of his present. The mainstream historical fact is inescapable. Eunuchs held the keys to the private lives of the imperial family, making them the ultimate gatekeepers of the emperor's person. The Forbidden City was a massive stratified bureaucracy of its own, but the inner court was where the real power fermented. While scholar officials debated policy in the outer court, the Hall of Supreme Harmony, the administrative offices, the eunuchs were in the inner court, the literal living quarters, the bedrooms, the dining halls, the gardens, and the private studies. Imagine yourself the Grand Secretary, waiting hours in the freezing dawn to present a meticulously crafted memorial on flood control. You stand there a pillar of Confucian ethics and learning. Meanwhile, the Grand Eunuch, a man perhaps functionally illiterate, but possessing a PhD in the emperor's moods, is inside. He is helping the emperor dress, or maybe serving the emperor, a bowl of midnight congee. He doesn't need to argue policy. He just needs to murmur, "Your Majesty looks exhausted from the long meeting with that verbose Grand Secretary." Or perhaps, "That memorial on flood control seems to have many seals from Minister X, who, as we know, is friends with the shady salt merchant." The official is separated from the emperor by layers of protocol paper and distance. The eunuch is separated by only the thickness of the emperor's silk robe. This intimate access allowed them to filter the world for the emperor. They controlled who saw him when they saw him, and crucially how they saw him. A memorial could be lost. A minor official seeking an audience could be told the emperor was indisposed. A rival concubine's letter could be intercepted. They became the ultimate human firewalls and information brokers of the imperial household. This access led to the insidious development of the Nai Ting inner court system of government, a shadowy parallel to the Wai Ting outer court bureaucracy. If the emperor was lazy young or simply overwhelmed by the complexity of governing, he would naturally rely on the person closest to him, the eunuch who was always there. In this environment, familiarity does not breed contempt. It breeds trust, and trust is political power. Now for a quirky or fringe tidbit. The level of physical intimacy reached astonishing lows. Eunuchs weren't just chamberlains. They were also responsible for the emperor's most personal, even embarrassing needs. For example, during the Ming Dynasty, one of the most critical roles for a high-ranking eunuch was managing the sleeping register, a literal log of which concubine was chosen to share the emperor's bed on any given night. The concubine, often wrapped in a blanket and carried by a eunuch, would be delivered to the chamber. And who was timing the encounter? A eunuch. A eunuch would stand outside and at the prescribed time, often very short for dynastic efficiency, whisper or call out, "Time is up," and then return the woman. This profound control over the emperor's sexual and reproductive life, the very purpose of the inner court, made them indispensable and terrifyingly knowledgeable about the deepest palace secrets. Imagine the leverage this provided. A eunuch who manages the sleeping register knows the emperor's preferences, his moods, during and after intimacy, and any casual pillow talk. This isn't just gossip. It's the most valuable intelligence in the realm. This is how power truly operates in a closed system. Historians still argue whether this unique access truly made the eunuchs the most powerful group in the palace, or if their power was entirely derivative, meaning it collapsed the moment the emperor withdrew his personal favor. Was their influence structural, baked into the system, or merely personal, dependent on one emperor? For you, the official, the distinction is academic. You know that if the emperor trusts a eunuch, that eunuch's word whispered in the comfort of a private moment carries more weight than your 1,000-word, rigorously argued policy document delivered in a cold administrative hall. You are seeing the fear crystallize. It's not the scar you fear. It's the unfiltered channel to the supreme authority that the scar bought. This proximity granted them knowledge, and in the next section, we'll see how they turned that knowledge into an empire of soft power, the control of court intelligence and gossip, and how that control could ruin a man faster than any army. You've witnessed the physical price and the political privilege of the eunuchs. Now we enter the atmosphere. They mastered the humid, pressurized realm of the inner court, where whispered words carry more force than an imperial decree. This is the domain of soft power gossip and the inner court. The eunuch wasn't just a gatekeeper. He was the central processing unit for all court intelligence. Picture the Grand Council debating foreign policy, a grand public spectacle. You are focused on the formal decisions, but the eunuch is focused on the real mechanics of power, the petty rivalries, the deep-seated grudges, the illicit favors, and the ambitions that fuel the human machine. The mainstream historical fact is that eunuchs, by necessity of their duties, maintained constant surveillance over the concubines, the ladies-in-waiting, and even the emperor's immediate family. The harem was a battleground, a highly organized competition to produce the next heir. Every single woman in that court was a potential empress, or worse, a mother who could steer the state. The eunuchs were the arbiters of order within this intense feminine environment. They managed the food, the clothing, the appointments, and the messaging. This daily involvement meant they possessed a terrifying granular understanding of everyone's vulnerabilities. Concubine A might hate concubine B because of a slight over a silk dress, but the eunuch knows concubine A's family back home is deeply in debt to a crooked merchant. He knows concubine B is secretly pregnant and trying to hide it, or maybe that the Empress Dowager has a weakness for certain forbidden books. The gossip isn't idle chatter, it's actionable intelligence, and the eunuch can package it, sell it, trade it, or deploy it as a weapon against his own rivals, or as a service to his patrons. Imagine you are a regional governor and you are trying to secure an important appointment in the capital. You might bribe a low-ranking official, but that's clumsy. The smart money goes to the eunuch, who serves the Empress's personal chamber. Why? Because that eunuch can whisper in a tone of casual concern that the governor you are replacing has a questionable reputation for impiety or for favoring the wrong sect. This subtle, almost untraceable influence, the poisoning of the well right at the source, was far more devastating than any open political attack. You can defend yourself against a formal accusation, but how do you defend yourself against a quiet, insidious rumor delivered while the emperor is sipping his morning tea? You can't. Now for a quirky or fringe tidbit. Eunuchs were sometimes used as gossip conduits by the women of the inner court themselves, because they were the only men allowed to move freely between the inner sanctums and the limited outer areas of the inner court, where certain officials or relatives might visit. They became indispensable couriers of private, sensitive messages. A concubine trying to send a message to her family, a daughter trying to communicate with her ailing mother, or even a princess seeking information about a potential marriage alliance, all relied on the eunuch. This turned high-ranking eunuchs into human switchboards, centralizing all the emotional, domestic, and political secrets of the imperial family. They knew where the skeletons were buried both literally and figuratively. This gave them a profound advantage over the scholar official class who were obsessed with decorum, public record, and formal procedures. The eunuch operated in the shadows where power is often decided. They saw the emperor not as the divine son of heaven, but as a man who was sometimes irritable, often lonely, and constantly subject to the desires and manipulations of the women around him. The eunuch's true power lay in his ability to cater to those desires and control those manipulations. Historians still argue whether the eunuch's effectiveness as information brokers was a deliberate, institutionalized power strategy deployed by the imperial system to keep the outer court officials honest, or if it was an organic development born purely out of their physical access and the human desire to exploit proximity for gain. Was the system meant to spy on the emperor's officials, or did the officials simply become collateral damage in the eunuch's own struggle for status? Regardless of the answer, the fear is real. You are a grand secretary, proud of your heritage, your learning, and your moral integrity. You stand in the outer court where everything is formal and predictable. The eunuch stands in the inner court where nothing's written down and everything is decided in the fragile moments of private intimacy. You realize that your entire career can be undone not by a bad policy decision, but by a single, well-placed word about your drinking habits or your son's bad gambling debts, information that only a eunuch could have gathered. That realization that helplessness against invisible power is the core of your fear, and it's the exact mechanism that allowed them to move from personal service to outright state administration, which is the terrifying shift we'll witness in the next stage. You are now keenly aware that the eunuch's greatest asset is proximity and silence. But silence cannot run an empire, and proximity eventually demands more tangible power. The fear you feel now is transitioning from personal anxiety to systemic dread as we examine the rise of the Secretariat power creep. This is the phase where eunuchs stopped just guarding the emperor's body and started controlling the machinery of the state itself. For centuries, the classical ideal was clear. The government was run by the waiting, the outer court, the ministers, the censors, the scholar officials trained in the Confucian classics and selected through rigorous examinations. They were the visible face of administration. But the emperors, particularly during the later dynasties like the Ming, began to mistrust these highly independent, often moralizing officials who frequently dared to criticize the imperial will. The mainstream historical fact is that emperors began systematically transferring key administrative duties from the outer court bureaucracy to eunuch-staffed agencies within the inner court. This was a deliberate effort to create a loyal, parallel government. The most famous example of this is the establishment of the Directorate of Ceremonial, or the Si Li Jian, especially during the Ming Dynasty. This body, staffed entirely by high-ranking eunuchs, evolved from managing palace rituals to becoming a de facto Grand Secretariat. Imagine the paper flow. A decree is drafted by the official Grand Secretariat. It must be reviewed, perhaps edited, and then approved by the emperor before being sent out. The emperor, perhaps a young boy or a man preoccupied with Taoist rituals, can't read every single document. Who reads them for him? The chief eunuch of the Directorate of Ceremonial. He would read the documents and then often affix a vermilion endorsement, a summary or recommendation written in red ink to the document before it was presented to the emperor for a final, often cursory stamp of approval. In a system of government where the volume of paperwork was overwhelming, the man who summarized the issue and suggested the solution essentially controlled the policy. The eunuch wasn't just filtering information. He was shaping the narrative of the entire state before it reached the supreme authority. This act, the control of the paper flow, was the greatest single act of power creep in imperial Chinese history. It meant that the outer court officials, the proudest men in the empire, were ultimately working for and being supervised by the very men they considered socially and morally beneath them. This bureaucratic shift created incredible wealth and corruption. The quirky or fringe tidbit that reveals the scope of this control is the eunuch's extensive involvement in palace construction procurement and state monopolies. Eunuchs were put in charge of the imperial manufactories, the factories producing everything from porcelain to silk, all the luxury goods demanded by the court. They controlled the movement of vast sums of state money purchasing materials, hiring laborers, and managing the logistics of the palace's colossal needs. This put them in a perfect position to siphon off funds, demand kickbacks from merchants, and build private fortunes that rivaled those of entire provinces. This institutionalized theft was often justified as being in service of the emperor's personal needs, making it impossible for the upright outer court censors to successfully investigate. If you, the censor, accuse a high-ranking eunuch of corruption for building a lavish new park, the eunuch simply replies that the park was constructed for the spiritual comfort of the Son of Heaven, and your objection becomes an act of near treason. Historians still argue whether the proliferation of eunuch power during the Ming Dynasty was the fundamental cause of the dynasty's later institutional decay, or merely a highly visible symptom of a systemic weakness in imperial rule, where emperors grew increasingly detached and sought powerful, loyal agents to do the dirty work of centralized power. Was the eunuch the disease or the fever? Regardless for you, the honest official, the distinction is meaningless. You see your beautifully written moralistic memorial on the proper administration of justice disappearing into the maw of the Directorate of Ceremonial, only to emerge warped, ignored, or bearing an implementation order that directly benefits the chief eunuch's personal interests. You have studied for decades, passed the hardest exams in the world, and your fate, and the fate of the realm, is now in the hands of a man who survived a brutal surgery and learned how to flatter an emperor. The fear is now official. You are subject to a shadow government that answers only to itself, setting the stage for the true crisis of eunuch power, the control of the young ruler, which we will turn to next. The fear of the eunuch has now become a fear of bureaucratic capture, where the paper flow of the state is filtered through their hands. But the greatest, most terrifying manifestation of their power occurs when the man on the dragon throne is not a seasoned ruler, but a scared, lonely child. We now turn to emperors as puppets, the boy-ruler problem. The mainstream historical fact is that the longevity of the eunuch institution guaranteed that they would be present during periods of dynastic weakness, particularly the ascension of child emperors or monarchs who were simply weak-willed or mentally incapacitated. The continuity of the eunuch service, often surviving multiple successions, meant they were the only constant in the inner court. Imagine yourself as a 6-year-old boy suddenly elevated to the status of son of heaven. You are isolated, terrified, and surrounded by thousands of people who bow to you, yet your entire life is dictated by ritual and restriction. Who is the one constant, stable paternal figure? It is often the grand eunuch, the chief of the Directorate of Ceremonial, or the man who has literally been with you since you were an infant. He is the one who brings you your toys, tells you stories, disciplines you softly, and crucially, explains the world to you. This relationship, a perverse kind of intimate mentorship, meant that the eunuch's influence was not merely political, it was formative. The young emperor would grow up viewing the grand eunuch as a trusted confidant and advisor, while viewing the scholar officials of the outer court as distant, critical, and often antagonistic figures who only came to complain and demand adherence to obscure, boring rules. When the boy becomes a teenager and then an adult, his deeply ingrained reliance on his eunuch attendant becomes a crippling political liability for the empire. A powerful historical example of this is the late Han Dynasty, where eunuchs form powerful political factions that directly controlled the young emperors, leading to decades of infighting and ultimately contributing to the collapse of the dynasty. Similarly, during the later Ming Dynasty, Emperor Wanli essentially retreated from government for decades, relying almost entirely on a succession of powerful eunuchs to manage the affairs of state, signing decrees brought to him by the inner court. The system wasn't broken, it was fully eunuch-controlled. For the scholar officials, this was a political and moral nightmare. The eunuch wasn't just advising the emperor, he was shaping the emperor's worldview from birth, filtering all knowledge and teaching the young ruler to fear or dismiss the legitimate bureaucracy. You, the honest official, risk your life by criticizing the grand eunuch because that criticism is interpreted by the emperor as an attack on his personal judgment and perhaps even his only trusted friend. Now for a quirky or fringe tidbit. Many high-ranking eunuchs, particularly those who served the young emperors, became expert in cultural and artistic matters as a way to bond with their charge. They weren't just administrators, they were sophisticated patrons of music, theater, painting, and calligraphy. They curated the young emperor's education and entertainment, ensuring they were indispensable, not just politically, but personally. This intimate cultural control meant they could frame the official scholarly arts as tedious and the eunuch-backed more popular arts as entertaining a subtle but effective way to distance the ruler from his legitimate advisors. Imagine the young emperor bored with a lecture on the Analects of Confucius, turning instead to the grand eunuch who has brought in the latest, slightly scandalous opera troupe. The eunuch has won the battle for the emperor's attention, which is the ultimate prize. Historians still argue whether the rise of the boy ruler was a structural flaw in the dynastic system that gave the eunuchs power, or if the eunuchs actively colluded to ensure that power transferred to the weakest possible heir, perhaps even influencing the selection process to secure a malleable child on the throne. Did they just seize the opportunity, or did they create it? For you, the official, the result is the same. The empire is run by a man who learned about governing from a man who learned about power from the shadow of the throne. And the eunuch's control only deepens as their influence moves outward, from the palace to the provinces, becoming the hand that collects the state's revenue, which we will examine next. The fear is no longer just about your job. It's about the very solvency of the empire. You've traced the eunuch's power from their personal suffering to their political influence over a naive emperor. Now you'll witness the fear metastasize as their reach extends from the forbidden city's polished tiles to the muddy fields of the provinces. We are addressing the eunuch as taxman, the corrupting grip. This is where the paper power becomes pocket power, directly impacting the common people and terrifying the local gentry. The mainstream historical fact is that imperial courts frequently appointed high-ranking eunuchs as tax commissioners, supervisors of mines and salt monopolies, and provincial inspectors, particularly during the Ming Dynasty. These roles were traditionally reserved for the highly scrutinized scholar officials, but the emperor seeking revenue outside the official slow-moving bureaucratic channels, or simply seeking wealth for himself and his inner court, would dispatch these personal agents. Imagine you are a local magistrate, a man of integrity deeply familiar with the nuances of local tax codes and the capacity of the peasants to pay. You work within a system of checks and balances. Then a eunuch arrives from the capital, appointed as a special revenue emissary. He arrives not on the back of an administrative decree, but on the emperor's personal order. He is haughty, entirely unconcerned with local economic realities, and his sole directive is simple: extract maximum wealth and send it back to the palace. This eunuch bypasses the entire official structure. He ignores the existing tax quotas and simply demands more. Because he is the direct personal representative of the Son of Heaven, he possesses what is known as imperial authority by proximity. He is virtually immune to local law or the complaints of the censors. If you, the magistrate, dare to protest that his demands will ruin the peasants and cause a local uprising, he merely hints that you are impeding the emperor's personal needs, and suddenly you are the one under investigation. The resulting fear in the provinces was palpable. Eunuchs did not follow the Confucian principle of ruling with benevolence. They were focused on short-term extraction. They used their power to extort funds far beyond the official tax rate, enriching themselves in the process. They became notorious for seizing private property, imposing illegal tolls, and engaging in brutal forms of coercion to fill the imperial coffers and, more importantly, their own. This abuse of fiscal power contributed directly to peasant unrest and the decline of the later dynasties. Here is a quirky or fringe tidbit that shows the extent of their fiscal micromanagement. Eunuchs were often granted the sole right to buy specific, highly lucrative local products, creating informal eunuch monopolies. For instance, they might control the purchase and transport of certain precious woods, rare minerals, or regional delicacies destined for the palace. They would underpay the producers, drastically inflating the final price sent to the imperial household, and pocketing the enormous difference. This didn't just enrich them, it choked local economies and created deep structural resentment among the merchant class and gentry who couldn't compete with someone who held the emperor's seal. The fear was therefore multi-layered, the fear of economic ruin and the fear of a complete breakdown of legal order where the man with the emperor's favor could override centuries of established governance. Historians still argue whether this practice of sending eunuchs into the provinces for direct revenue collection was an indicator of the emperor's increasing distrust of his own scholar-official bureaucracy, or whether it was a deliberate, cunning strategy by the central court to break the power of entrenched local official and gentry families by introducing an external, temporary, and absolutely loyal extractor. Was it administrative necessity or just cynical corruption? For you, the honest local official, the distinction is immaterial. You look out over your district and see the inevitable seeds of rebellion being sown by a single greedy eunuch and his band of armed retainers, all acting with the untouchable authority of the dragon throne. You realize your power based on law and morality is fragile. His power based on proximity and extraction is absolute. And as their external power grew, their internal methods became even darker, giving rise to the next most terrifying manifestation of their control, the secret police. The fear of the eunuchs has now extended beyond the palace and into the pockets of the populace. But revenue extraction is merely the prelude to the ultimate expression of unchecked power surveillance and political terror. We now confront the dark side of merit, the spy master. This is the moment when the eunuch transforms from an administrator into the state's most effective and feared instrument of oppression. The mainstream historical fact is that during certain dynasties, most notably the Ming eunuchs were placed in command of terrifying, sophisticated internal security and secret police organizations that operated outside the traditional legal and administrative framework. The most notorious of these was the Eastern Depot, Dongchang, established in 1420 by the Yongle Emperor, and the later Western Depot, Exiskuchang. Imagine this. You are a high-ranking official, perhaps a censor, celebrated for your courage in criticizing a corrupt minister. You have passed your exams, you have moral authority, and you feel the law is on your side. But the man you criticized might simply be the target of a eunuch-led investigation. The Eastern Depot, headed by a grand eunuch, had the authority to arrest, imprison, interrogate, and execute virtually anyone, including military commanders and cabinet ministers, often without due process or oversight from the official judicial system. The fear they inspired came from their absolute unaccountability and their methods. The scholar official's power was based on public record formal decrees and the rule of law. The Eastern Depot's power was based on silent secrecy and torture. Their agents, often dressed as civilians or blending into the general populace, were everywhere in tea houses, marketplaces, and even within the outer court ministries. They were listening for any hint of disloyalty criticism of the emperor, or more commonly criticism of the eunuch in charge of the depot, or signs of political dissidence. This created an atmosphere of absolute political paralysis, a culture where nobody dared to speak openly. If you were overheard complaining about the price of salt, which might be due to a eunuch monopoly, you could be arrested under suspicion of maligning the government and disappear into the depot's infamous prisons. Now for a quirky or fringe tidbit that underscores the psychological terror. The Western Depot, created later, was actually feared more than the Eastern Depot, despite having a shorter lifespan because its scope was even wider and its methods even more arbitrary. The head of the Western Depot, Huang Zhi, was a favorite eunuch of Emperor Chenghua. Wang Zhi's agents weren't just looking for crime, they were looking for potential crime or even signs of dissatisfaction. They became experts at interpreting body language, overheard phrases, and subtle social slights as evidence of sedition. The people lived in a state of anticipatory fear, terrified not of what they did, but of what they might have thought that someone else might have misinterpreted. This complete reversal of the social order, where the man who holds the chamber pot holds the power of life and death over the country's most elite scholars, was the ultimate reason why the eunuchs were so reviled and feared by the intellectual class. It was a victory of ruthless pragmatism over moral idealism. Historians still argue whether the emperors who created and empowered these eunuch-run secret police organizations saw them as a necessary counterbalance to the overweening power of the scholarly bureaucracy, or whether the creation of the depots was simply an act of pure tyrannical convenience, providing the emperor with an instantly loyal, brutally efficient and disposable tool for executing his will, free from the annoying moralizing of his official advisors. You, the official, now realize that your life is a tightrope walk over an abyss. You can pass every exam, follow every law, and serve the emperor faithfully, but a single jealous or slighted eunuch working under the guise of the Eastern Depot can invent a conspiracy, write your name on a scroll, and have you dragged from your bed by men who answer to a man who in turn answers only to his master's personal whims. The fear is no longer political. It is personal, existential, and utterly paralyzing. However, the story of the eunuch is not entirely one of oppression. There is one massive, world-changing exception we must examine next. The fear that eunuchs inspired from the inner court to the depths of the secret police seems absolute. They are the epitome of unchecked parasitic power. But the history of the eunuch institution, spanning over 2 millennia, is too vast to be reduced to just internal corruption and tyranny. There are outliers figures whose careers defy the stereotype, and none are more spectacular than the man we now encounter, Admiral Zheng He, the unexpected commander. Imagine the contradiction. The same system that birthed the ruthless spy masters of the Eastern Depot also produced one of the world's greatest maritime explorers, a man whose fleets dwarfed those of Columbus and Magellan combined. The mainstream historical fact is that Zheng He was a high-ranking Ming Dynasty eunuch who between 1405 and 1433 commanded 7 massive naval expeditions known as the Treasure Voyages across the South China Sea, the Indian Ocean, and as far as East Africa. These voyages were not for conquest, but for the projection of Chinese soft power trade and the collection of tribute. Why was a eunuch chosen for this unprecedented task? You, the scholar official, would naturally expect this honor to fall to a decorated general or a seasoned official from the Ministry of War. But the emperor specifically, the Yongle Emperor, the same one who founded the Eastern Depot, preferred eunuchs for missions requiring absolute loyalty, large-scale resource management, and diplomatic subtlety. The scholar officials, in the emperor's view, were too bound by precedent, too slow and too prone to questioning the emperor's grand vision. They were, in a word, unreliable for a project of this scale and ambition. Zheng He was the perfect agent. Born Ma He, a Muslim from Yunnan, he was captured as a boy during the Ming conquest of the area and castrated, eventually becoming a close personal attendant to the future Yongle Emperor. His background gave him a cosmopolitan perspective. His loyalty was absolute, since his status depended entirely on the emperor, and his command was unchallengeable because he carried the direct mandate of the Son of Heaven. Imagine the sight: enormous treasure ships some over 400 feet long with 9 masts and a displacement of thousands of tons carrying thousands of sailors, soldiers, interpreters, and officials. This fleet, an economic and military powerhouse, was commanded not by a general from a famous family, but by a eunuch. This proved demonstrably that the lack of the BAO did not equate to a lack of competence, courage, or executive ability. It showed that given the chance, the very men excluded from the traditional paths of power could achieve historical greatness. Now for a quirky or fringe tidbit that contrasts sharply with the courtly drama. Zheng He was known by the nickname Sanbao Taijian. Sanbao Taijian, meaning three-jewel eunuch, often associated with the Buddhist concept of the three jewels, Buddha, Dharma, Sangha. He was a devout Muslim, yet he also made offerings at Buddhist and Taoist temples for the safety of his voyages. This religious pluralism and pragmatic diplomacy were essential for navigating the multi-faith port cities of Southeast Asia and India, demonstrating a flexibility rarely found in the rigid Confucian scholar official class. For you, the official, this is a crisis of worldview. You despise the eunuchs as corrupt parasites, yet one of them is now an international figure commanding fleets that secure China's dominance of the seas and bring back exotic treasures like giraffes, which were interpreted as the mythical Qilin, a sign of the emperor's virtuous rule. You cannot simply dismiss all eunuchs as incompetent. Zheng He makes a mockery of that argument. Historians still argue whether the abrupt cessation of the treasure voyages after Zheng He's death and the subsequent destruction of the naval records were primarily due to the intense jealousy and political opposition of the Confucian scholar officials who hated the expense and the eunuch's power, or if the Ming court was simply shifting its strategic focus and resources to defending the northern borders against the Mongols. Was it ideological pushback against eunuch power or geopolitical necessity? Regardless, the legacy of Zheng He stands as a powerful, uncomfortable reminder. The structure that produced the feared court manipulator also produced the globe-trotting admiral. This complexity only heightened the fear of the scholar officials because it meant they couldn't just fight a simple moral battle against corruption. They had to fight a political battle against men who were sometimes better, more capable, and more fiercely loyal to the emperor's personal vision than they were. That deep ideological conflict is what we explore next. The history of the eunuchs is a battleground not just of wills, but of ideologies. You've seen the good Zheng He and the very bad, the Eastern Depot, and now you must confront the heart of the conflict, the scholar's fury. Conflicts with bureaucracy. The fear of the eunuch was fundamentally tied to the deep philosophical war between the inner court and the outer court. The mainstream historical fact is that the entire imperial Chinese bureaucracy was predicated on the Confucian ideal that government should be managed by moral, educated men selected by merit through the imperial examination system. These scholar officials viewed themselves as the guardians of tradition, morality, and the long-term well-being of the state, often referring to the emperor as the first gentleman who should adhere to their benevolent moral teachings. The eunuchs, by contrast, were often uneducated, rose through personal service and flattery rather than scholarly merit, and operated entirely on the principle of absolute loyalty to the emperor's personal and immediate desires. They were, in the eyes of the officials, a cancer on the body politic, an illegitimate, uncultured, and immoral power that circumvented the proper channels of governance. Imagine the bitter irony for you, the scholar official. You spent decades memorizing classics, practicing calligraphy, and studying statecraft to pass the Jinshi exam. You endure years of meager provincial postings, slowly working your way up the meritocracy. Then you arrive in the capital only to find that the policy decisions you debate in the Grand Secretariat are being vetoed or distorted by a man who a decade ago was sweeping the emperor's garden. This wasn't just a political disagreement, it was a profound existential insult to the entire structure of the Chinese state. This conflict manifested in two terrifying ways for the officials. First, the eunuchs controlling the flow of information could easily frame an upright official's moral critique as an act of disloyalty or treason to the emperor. The officials' attempts to enforce Confucian morality were interpreted as arrogance or veiled attempts to seize the emperor's power. Second, the eunuchs were not afraid to use the tools of the secret police like the Eastern Depot to crush their official rivals, physically, something the officials could never do to the eunuchs who were protected by imperial whim. Here is a quirky or fringe tidbit that highlights the moral dimensions of the struggle. The scholar officials often tried to use the eunuchs' lack of lineage, the missing bao, as a point of humiliation and moral attack. They would publicly refer to eunuchs using derogatory terms that emphasized their incompleteness or lack of family structure. This was an attempt to delegitimize the eunuchs, socially hoping that the moral pressure of Confucian society would force the emperor to dismiss them. The eunuchs in turn fought back by adopting sons and establishing faux lineages, amassing wealth to compensate for their lack of heritage, and using their proximity to the emperor to simply have their scholarly critics purged or tortured. It was an asymmetrical war, one side fought with paper, the other with steel. The most famous historical manifestation of this struggle was the repeated waves of partisan prohibitions during the Han Dynasty and the endless accusations and purges during the Ming, where powerful eunuchs orchestrated the mass arrests, torture, and execution of officials who dared to challenge their power or denounce their corruption. For the scholar class, this was a period of sustained terror. Historians still argue whether the scholar officials' unyielding, often suicidal opposition to eunuch power was a noble defense of moral governance and an attempt to save the dynasty from corruption, or if their resistance was primarily a self-interested defense of their own class privileges against a rival power faction that threatened their control over the state's administration. Was it patriotism or professional jealousy? For you, the scholar standing in the cold morning air awaiting an audience, you know only this: every word of critique you utter, however well-intentioned, could be your last. The eunuch is not just your opponent in policy. He is your opponent in the fundamental definition of legitimate power. And this volatile winner-take-all struggle leads inevitably to the catastrophic cycles of violence and massacres that define the eunuch's terrifying history, which we'll see next. You have witnessed the ideological war between the scholars and the eunuchs, a conflict that escalated from whispered gossip to bureaucratic paralysis and secret police terror. But every rise to power is matched by a spectacular fall. We now focus on the dynastic cycle: eunuch, fall, and purge. The fear inspired by eunuchs was often returned to them tenfold in waves of bloody retribution. The mainstream historical fact is that periods of supreme eunuch power were almost invariably followed by violent massacres and purges orchestrated by new emperors, empress dowagers, or successful rival factions like generals or officials. This was a recurring pattern in Chinese history, a systemic cleansing required to restore the legitimate authority of the state and break the cycle of inner court control. Imagine the atmosphere upon the death of an emperor who had relied heavily on eunuchs, particularly a childless or weak ruler. The political ground suddenly shifts. A new strong emperor ascends, or a regency council is formed, perhaps led by the empress dowager or a powerful uncle. Their first most critical task is to eliminate the entrenched power structure that shackled the previous reign. That structure, of course, is the eunuch faction. The purges were not subtle arrests. They were often mass killings designed to send an immediate and brutal message. The entire administrative apparatus that the eunuchs had built, the directorate of ceremonial, the secret depots, and the provincial revenue offices, would be dissolved overnight. The high-ranking eunuchs, the grand eunuchs, who had been the most feared men in the empire, would be executed often publicly, and their vast fortunes confiscated. The lower-ranking eunuchs were typically dismissed back to the streets, or exiled where they quickly starved or perished, having lost their only source of security. A key historical example is the fall of the eunuch faction at the end of the Han Dynasty around 189 AD, a terrifying moment when the general He Jin ordered the massacre of the eunuchs. The situation spiraled into chaos, with the capital city of Luoyang becoming a killing field. Thousands of people who simply looked like eunuchs, men with soft faces or no beards, were mistakenly killed by vengeful soldiers and citizens. This wasn't justice. It was a spasm of social and political violence. The fear, therefore, was reciprocal. The scholar officials feared the eunuchs during their rise, but the eunuchs lived with the constant terrifying knowledge that their power was temporary, and their downfall would be bloody and absolute. They were tied to the life and whims of one single man, the emperor, and the moment that link was broken, their enemies would rush in for vengeance. Here is a quirky or fringe tidbit that reveals the psychological desperation of the purges. Eunuchs often built elaborate spiritual retirement homes, or private fortified monasteries outside the capital to serve as safe houses during times of transition, and they would pour immense wealth into temples, hoping to gain merit and divine protection against the inevitable purges. They knew their political life was a gamble, and they tried to buy spiritual insurance. These retreats, however, rarely saved them. Their wealth only made them a bigger target. Imagine the grand eunuch who signed the death warrant of dozens of officials, now hiding in a remote mountain temple, praying desperately to a bodhisattva, knowing that the emperor's soldiers are closing in. His life, which was predicated on controlling proximity to power, ends because he lost that proximity. Historians still argue whether these violent purges were truly effective long-term measures for solving the problem of corruption, or if they were merely short-term political theater that satisfied the vengeance of the scholarly class without fundamentally altering the structural flaw in the imperial system, namely the emperor's constant desire for a trusted, loyal personal agent operating outside the official bureaucracy. Was the purge a cure, or just a temporary remission? For you, the official watching a grand eunuch being led to the execution ground, the fear is replaced by a temporary, chilling satisfaction. But in your heart, you know the truth. Power abhors a vacuum. The systemic weakness that allowed this eunuch to rise still exists, and it is only a matter of time before the next ambitious man castrated or not finds a way to bend the emperor's ear and create a new shadow government. That structural reliance found its apex in the dynasty we turn to. Next, the period where eunuch power achieved its most notorious and terrifying height. The cyclical purges provided only brief respite. The systemic need for a loyal, unattached agent always brought the eunuchs back. This pattern culminated during the period we now examine, shadowing the throne, the Ming Dynasty apex. If you want to know why ancient Chinese eunuchs were truly feared, look no further than the Ming, the dynasty, where their power was most institutionalized, expansive, and terrifying. The mainstream historical fact is that the Ming Dynasty, 1368-1644, represents the peak of eunuch political power and institutionalization, particularly following the relocation of the capital to Beijing and the establishment of the Forbidden City. The first Ming Emperor Hongwu had tried to ban eunuchs from participating in politics, famously inscribing an iron tablet with this prohibition. Yet within a generation, his successor, the Yongle Emperor, massively expanded their roles, finding them indispensable for administering his new centralized court. Imagine the sheer scale of the Ming eunuch establishment. The system was meticulously bureaucratized, comprising the 12 directorates, 4 bureaus, and 8 offices, collectively known as the 24 yamen. This complex administrative network controlled virtually every aspect of the emperor's life, and the palace's operations from textile production and ritual music to weaponry, and most critically, the communication flow through the powerful Directorate of Ceremonial. This was not a few dozen household servants. This was an entire shadow government of tens of thousands of men, each with ranks and salaries, a parallel state that ran alongside the official bureaucracy. The fear among the outer court officials was amplified because the eunuch system was now legitimate, even if they viewed it as morally corrupt. You, the official, were no longer fighting a temporary court favorite. You were fighting an entrenched institution sanctioned by the emperor himself. The Ming eunuchs used their institutionalized power to perfect the very mechanisms of terror we have already discussed. The eastern and western depots became the bywords for political oppression. The officials knew that no secret was safe. No criticism was tolerated, and no legal defense would hold up against the summary justice of the eunuch spymasters. Here is a quirky or fringe tidbit that illustrates the domestic power of Ming eunuchs. The wealthiest grand eunuchs maintained private miniature court systems within their own residences. These Taijian would hire their own staff, adopt sons, and demand the same type of deference and elaborate protocol from their subordinates that the emperor received. They weren't just servants, they were petty kings. The most powerful among them, like Wei Zhongxian in the late Ming, even had shrines erected in their honor while they were still alive, where officials were forced to pay homage, a horrifying usurpation of the emperor's unique status, and a profound insult to every Confucian principle. Wei Zhongxian, arguably the most feared man in Ming history, used the Eastern Depot to orchestrate the mass imprisonment and execution of the righteous scholar officials of the Donglin movement, cementing the eunuch's reputation as the ultimate dynastic wreckers. The officials were not just killed. They were tortured and publicly humiliated, serving as a brutal lesson in the cost of political opposition. Historians still argue whether the Ming eunuchs' massive accumulation of power was primarily a function of their superior organization and control of information, or whether it was an inevitable response to the deliberate detachment and frequent incompetence of the later Ming emperors, who preferred to delegate all heavy lifting to their personal staff rather than engage with the demanding, moralizing outer court. Did the eunuch fill a vacuum or create one? For you, the scholar, living under the late Ming, this is the ultimate manifestation of your fear. The man who holds the fate of the empire in his hands is a eunuch, a man who sits outside the moral order, who controls the secret police, and who has the ear of a reclusive emperor. You exist only by his temporary tolerance. Your terror is the direct result of the Ming emperor's desire for absolute, unchallengeable personal loyalty above all other virtues, a reliance that proved nearly fatal to the dynasty itself. You have witnessed the Ming Dynasty's apex of eunuch power, a period of organized terror and shadow governance that codified the scholar's fear. But fear is not just political. It's cultural. The decades of eunuch abuse and intrigue didn't just pass. They became permanently etched into the Chinese collective psyche. We now explore the whisper in the wall's cultural trauma, This is how the real-life Grand Eunuch morphed into a terrifying, enduring villain in art, theater, and folklore. The mainstream historical fact is that the image of the eunuch became synonymous in Chinese popular culture with malice, deceit, cruelty, and the corruption of the imperial ideal. They ceased to be seen merely as court administrators and became a powerful archetype, the villain who works in the shadows, who smiles while delivering a deadly accusation, and whose ambition is unbound by familial or moral ties. Imagine yourself attending a popular opera in a provincial city during the Ming Dynasty, long after the Ming's eunuch-fueled power had ended. The play is about a virtuous official fighting a corrupt court. When the villain appears, the cruel minister who unjustly persecutes the hero he is inevitably stylized to look and act like a classical Grand Eunuch. He is typically depicted as pale effeminate, in his mannerisms often wearing purple or yellow silks, colors associated with the inner court, and speaking in a high, often artificially sharp voice. This theatrical representation wasn't just entertainment. It was a way for the common people and the educated gentry to process and externalize the terror of history. The eunuch became the scapegoat for all that went wrong with the imperial system. This cultural caricature was fueled by two key factors. First, it was a safe way to critique the imperial government. If you publicly criticized the living emperor or his ministers, you faced the Eastern Depot. But if you created a fictional eunuch villain from the past, you could indirectly air grievances about the persistence of corruption and arbitrary power without risking treason. Second, the popular image was highly effective propaganda for the victorious Qing rulers and the scholar class who sought to discredit the previous Ming regime by constantly reminding the populace that the Ming had been destroyed by eunuch power. Here is a quirky or fringe tidbit that shows how the trauma manifested in belief systems. In some regions, the eunuch spirit was believed to be a particularly malicious and powerful form of ghost. Because he had died incomplete, often through violence, and without the proper lineage to perform ancestral rites, his spirit was considered restless, vengeful, and prone to preying on the living. This belief further solidified the eunuch as a figure of deep-seated superstitious dread, connecting their physical state to metaphysical danger. You, the weary citizen, did not need to have been personally wronged by a eunuch to fear them. You grew up with stories, operas, and popular narratives that portrayed them as the ultimate agents of chaos. The fear became a cultural shorthand for the loss of moral authority at the center of the empire. Historians still argue whether the enduring negative cultural portrayal of eunuchs was an accurate reflection of their general behavior and their institutional impact on Chinese governance, or if it was largely a successful decades-long campaign of political and ideological slander waged by the Confucian scholar class to cement their moral authority over the court. Was the stereotype earned, or was it manufactured? For you, the listener settling deeper into your pillow, the distinction doesn't matter. You are watching a puppet show in a crowded market square. The sight of the eunuch villain, with his painted white face and exaggerated cruelty, sends a familiar, chilling shudder through the crowd. The power of the inner court eunuch, even after his historical role ended, remained a profound symbol of arbitrary, cruel power, a power that could strike from the deepest shadows of the palace and ruin the lives of the righteous. But the system had to end eventually, and in the next and final historical section, we will witness the slow, pathetic decline of this centuries-old institution. You have journeyed through the terror of the eunuch's rise, their institutionalization under the Ming, and their final cultural embalming as the archetypal villain. Now we witness the quiet, often pathetic end of this 2,000-year-old institution, the last of their kind, fading echoes. The fear they inspired didn't end in a dramatic battle, but in a whimper of irrelevance. The mainstream historical fact is that the institution of the eunuch was formally abolished in 1924, when the last emperor of China, Puyi, was expelled from the Forbidden City following the 1911 Xinhai Revolution that overthrew the Ming Dynasty. The vast majority of the thousands of eunuchs still serving in the palace were summarily dismissed and forced back into a world that no longer had a place for them. The decline actually began much earlier. When the Manchu Qing dynasty replaced the Ming in 1644, the new rulers were acutely aware of the Ming's fatal flaw, the disastrous power of the eunuch factions. The early Qing emperors took severe measures to restrict their power-returning control of key administrative bodies like the Directorate of Ceremonial and the secret depots back to the outer court officials. The number of eunuchs was drastically reduced, and the penalties for eunuchs who dared to interfere in politics were made immediate and deadly. Imagine the atmosphere in the Qing court. The eunuchs were still essential domestic servants managing the harem and the imperial household, but their status had been permanently curtailed. They were stripped of their vast political and military powers. They still had proximity, but that proximity was now ring-fenced by watchful Manchu officials and strictly enforced rules. The fear they inspired turned into low-grade anxiety for the officials who watched them carefully, but their capacity to execute officials was virtually gone. The final demise, however, was pitiful. When the Qing dynasty collapsed in 1911, the imperial household was allowed to remain in the Forbidden City, retaining a few hundred servants, including the remaining elderly eunuchs, for over a decade. But when the warlord Feng Yuxiang finally expelled Puyi in 1924, the eunuchs, many in their 60s, 70s, and 80s, suddenly found themselves homeless, penniless, and without any social support structure. Here is a quirky or fringe tidbit that is heartbreakingly real. Many of the last surviving eunuchs formed a charitable organization, the Injiuan Academy of Kindness and Charity, a kind of poorhouse or retirement home outside the capital, pooling their meager resources just to survive. They relied on charity selling off the few remaining trinkets they had managed to retain and living in constant fear of poverty and a lonely death. They were the last living embodiments of a system that had once held the power of life and death over millions, now reduced to begging for food. One of the most famous of these last survivors was Sun Yaoting, 1902-1996, one of the final boys to be voluntarily castrated for the palace just before the revolution, only to arrive at the Forbidden City right as the end was approaching. His autobiography provided a painful first-hand account of the system's cruelty and the final degradation of its members. Historians still argue whether the decline of the eunuch institution was a clear example of successful institutional reform by the Qing emperors, or if their eventual demise was simply an inevitable consequence of the collapse of the entire imperial system in the face of modern Western influences and internal revolution. Did the Qing cure the illness, or did the whole patient die? For you, the curious traveler of history, the final image is not one of a powerful, silk-clad grand eunuch signing a death warrant, but of a bent elderly man shuffling quietly through the streets of Beijing, carrying nothing but a small, empty lacquer box, the one that once held his Bao, a ghost of the empire, ignored by the new republic and soon to be forgotten by history. The fear is dissolved, leaving behind only a profound, complicated sadness for a life chosen out of desperation and ending in obscurity. It's time now to leave the echoing silence of the Forbidden City and the complicated legacy of the men who walked its walls. The journey through the fear of the eunuchs, that intense mixture of political anxiety, ideological conflict, and raw visceral terror is complete. Let the images fade now. The young boy enduring the cutter's knife, the shadow of the secret depot agent in the tea house, the massive sails of Zheng He's treasure fleet on the horizon, and the final quiet solitude of the old man on the streets of the New Republic. Each image is a thread in the rich, confusing tapestry of power. Take a moment to feel the weight of that history. All that ambition, that pain, that ruthless drive for status purchased at the highest possible price. The rise and fall of their power reminds us that in any closed system, the person with the most intimate access, the one willing to pay the highest personal cost, often wields the sharpest, most unseen power. But all power, even the power purchased with a man's future, is temporary. Now let your breathing slow, your muscles relax, and the echoes of the historical drama recede into the distance. There are no more secret police, no more jealous officials, and no more young emperors waiting to be manipulated. There is only the soft hum of the night and the assurance that you are safe resting and carrying a new deep knowledge of a complicated past. The walls of the palace are far away, and the doors are closed. Just sink into the stillness and welcome the darkness. Sweet dreams.